On a cold October afternoon in 1918, nearly 700 American soldiers vanished into the Argonne Forest, and within days, only about 200 were still alive. Surrounded by German troops, shelled by their own artillery, and cut off from all communication, they became known as the Lost Battalion. Their only hope of survival would come from an exhausted little pigeon named Cher Ami. To understand why men in 1918 were betting their lives on birds, we have to step back into the brutal reality of World War I communications. Telephone lines were shredded by shell fire, radios were bulky and unreliable, and runners were often cut down before they reached their destination. In that chaos, homing pigeons, small, fast, and surprisingly dependable, became a lifeline between the front lines and command. Cher Ami was one of hundreds of pigeons used by the U.S. Army Signal Corps in France, but nothing about her early life suggested she would become a legend. Small and unremarkable, she was trained like the others, taught to recognize her loft and fly home, no matter where she was released. What made her extraordinary was not her size or speed, but what she would endure. By the fall of 1918, the Meuse-Argonne offensive was grinding forward in northeastern France, the largest American operation of the war. The 77th Division, made up largely of New York City draftees, was ordered to push through the tangled Argonne Forest and break German lines. Among them was the 1st Battalion of the 308th Infantry, soon to be trapped behind enemy lines. On October 2nd, Major Charles Whittlesey led his men forward under the assumption that friendly units were advancing on their flanks. They pushed aggressively through the undergrowth, taking casualties but gaining ground, until they realized something chilling. The units on their left and right had stalled, and Whittlesey's force had pushed alone into a pocket of German-held territory. By nightfall, roughly 554 men, later joined by stragglers bringing the total close to 700, found themselves in a shallow ravine near the Charlevoix mill. German machine guns blocked their rear, snipers watched from the trees, and every attempt to send runners for help ended in silence. With no clear way out, Whittlesey ordered his men to dig in and hold. The next day, the Germans tightened the noose. They cut off food and ammunition, raked the ravine with machine gun fire, and began lobbing grenades and mortars from the high ground. The Lost Battalion, as newspapers would later call them, had no medical support, little water, and almost no way to tell headquarters where they were or that they were still fighting. Then came the most bitter twist: friendly fire. Misreading the situation, American artillery began shelling the very ravine where Whittlesey's men were clinging to life. The Lost Battalion was now being pounded from both sides, by Germans above and by their own guns behind. Desperate, Whittlesey turned to his last reliable means of communication: carrier pigeons. Several birds had already been released with coordinates and pleas for support, but none had returned. One by one, German bullets and shrapnel had plucked the birds out of the sky before they could reach American lines. By October 4th, only one pigeon remained: Cher Ami. She was their final thread to the outside world, a single living messenger that stood between the battalion and annihilation by their own artillery. Around her leg, a soldier carefully fastened a tiny capsule containing a hastily scribbled message. The note was blunt and harrowing. "We're along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." Beneath the coordinates and the plea was the signature of the battalion's commander, Major Whittlesey, staking his men's fate on one fragile bird. When Cher Ami was released, she shot upward through the branches into a storm of gunfire. German soldiers, well aware of what pigeons meant, opened up with rifles and machine guns, trying to swat her from the sky. Below, the men in the ravine watched their last hope become a tiny grey speck against the smoke. She didn't get far before she was hit. A bullet tore through her breast, shattering one leg, and another round blinded her in one eye. For most birds, that would have been the end of the story: another body falling back into the trees below. But Cher Ami kept flying. Wounded, bleeding, and half-blind, she fought to gain altitude and turned toward the distant American lines she had been trained to find. Every wing beat was a race against blood loss, shock, and the random chaos of a sky filled with steel. Back in the ravine, the shells kept falling. Men pressed themselves against the earth as their own artillery chewed up trees and bodies alike, wondering if the pigeon had been killed like all the rest. Some, later, recalled thinking that if Cher Ami didn't make it, none of them would leave that forest alive. Against all odds, Cher Ami reached the signal corps loft behind the lines, crashing in, covered in blood and barely alive. The loft keepers found her with the message tubes still attached, hanging from what remained of her shattered leg. They rushed the note to the artillery commanders, who realized with horror they had been hammering their own men. Artillery orders were changed. The barrage shifted off the ravine, and the deadly rain of friendly shells finally stopped. For the first time in days, the Lost Battalion was being spared by someone who actually knew where they were, because a bird had told them. Relief, however, did not come immediately. For several more days, the surrounded Americans fought off repeated German attacks, surviving on dwindling rations and whatever water they could find. By the time other U.S. units finally broke through, on October 7th, only 194 of the roughly 700 men who had entered the ravine could still stand. The men who emerged, gaunt, bandaged, and hollow-eyed, were quickly photographed. Their ordeal turned into newsprint and propaganda. The press dubbed them the Lost Battalion, a name that stuck even though their commander had always known exactly where he was. What had truly been lost in that forest were lives, innocence, and any illusion that modern war spared the brave. In the months that followed, the survivors were celebrated back home. They marched up Fifth Avenue in New York City under victory arches, cheered by crowds who had read breathless accounts of their stand in the Argonne. Their story quickly became part of America's emerging World War I mythology. Some of their comrades achieved individual fame, like Abraham Krotoshinsky, the runner who had crawled through German lines to guide rescuers to the ravine. Photographs and even early films turned these men into living symbols of endurance and sacrifice. Yet, behind every famous face were dozens of others who never came home. Their ordeal inspired books like History and Rhymes of the Lost Battalion, blending grim battlefield memories with dark humor and poetry. Within a year, a feature film dramatized their story, with some actual survivors appearing on screen. The Lost Battalion became legend almost before their wounds had time to heal. While the men tried to rebuild their lives, Cher Ami was fighting for hers. Army medics and veterinarians worked to save the little bird who had carried the most important message of their campaign. They could not save her shattered leg, but they fashioned a tiny wooden prosthetic so she could stand again. For her service, Cher Ami was awarded the French Croix de Guerre with Palme, one of France's highest military honors, to the soldiers who had survived the Argonne. She was more than a decorated bird. She was the reason they had lived to see home again. In an age of tanks and machine guns, their savior had been a creature that weighed barely a pound. Cher Ami died in 1919 from complications of her wounds, but her story didn't end there. Preserved by taxidermists, she was placed on display at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, standing on her little wooden leg. Visitors could look into the glass case and see the battered bird who had carried a battalion's fate on a scrap of paper. Decades later, World War I veterans, men who had survived trenches, gas, and relentless artillery, would still speak with awe about the role of pigeons in saving lives. In a conflict defined by industrial-scale killing, these small, vulnerable messengers were a strange counterpoint, symbols of loyalty and persistence. Cher Ami, above all, became the feathered face of that quiet heroism. Today, the Lost Battalion is remembered in books, films, and memorials scattered across former battlefields and hometown squares. Their story is often told as one of courage under impossible pressure. But it is also a reminder of how easily soldiers can be swallowed by the fog of war. Without a one-eyed pigeon's impossible flight, their entire sacrifice might have been erased by their own side's guns. Standing before Cher Ami's glass case, it's tempting to see her as a quirky footnote in a vast, tragic war. But if you listen closely to the accounts of the men she saved, you hear something else, a profound gratitude for a tiny ally who did what even the best technology of 1918 could not. In the end, the story of Cher Ami and the Lost Battalion is not just about a pigeon. It's about how, in our darkest hours, survival can hinge on the most unlikely of heroes.